Okay, in this lecture I investigate the work of 19th century artist Edouard Manet in relation to parodic literary practices in Charles Baudelaire's art criticism and Émile Zola's naturalist novels. Baudelaire's A Painter of Modern Life of 1863 serves as a point of departure for arguing that the mirror functions as both metaphor and metonymy of modernity and its dualities, at once fleeting and fragmentary, yet eternal and immutable. And I must ask for lights overhead because I can't see down in terms of mirroring effects.
Ela quer que acenda que ela não está enxergando.
Luz.
Okay, I'm going to start over. In this lecture, I investigate the work of 19th century artist Edouard Manet in relation to the parodic literary practices in Charles Baudelaire's art criticism and Émile Zola's naturalist novels. Baudelaire's The Painter of Modern Life of 1863 serves as a point of departure for arguing that the mirror functions as both metaphor and metonymy of modernity and its dualities, at once fleeting and fragmentary, yet eternal and immutable. The Painter of Modern Life also exemplifies how artistic self-doubling becomes a mandate for the artist's response to multifarious modern urban conditions. As I will show, Manet's A Bart de Folie Bergère of 1882 best demonstrates Baudelairian parodying devices and their ironic effects. By considering this painting within the volatile context of a renovated Parisian metropolis, I argue that the painter, like the novelist, used the mirror as a parodic device to promote critical self-reflection upon modern conditions and artistic norms. This painting, among others, will be used to illustrate how a word and image approach to visual and verbal parody restores the signifying functions of artistic and literary techniques to the realm of social and cultural practices. At this point, I want to briefly comment on the methodology that guides my research. A comparative study of Manet's visual parody with verbal parody provides a case study to demonstrate a discursive methodology in which word and image function as interactive yet independent signifying agents. That is, Manet's paintings do not illustrate literary texts, but participate in a shared discourse on modernity and its experiential effects. Here I use discourse in the spirit of Michel Foucault's Archaeology of Knowledge of 1969. That is, discourse connotes a body of knowledge ordered by recurring and recognizable practices, statements, and signs. Thus, while I argue that A Bart de Folie Bergère is a manifesto of Baudelaire modernity, I also maintain that Manet's painting is not simply a graphic demonstration of Baudelaire's essay, The Painter of Modern Life. Rather, in this painting, Manet transcribed his own formulation of the visual, technical means by which to represent modernity. As I will show, just as the mirror motif subverts literary conventions and narrative structures in Zola's novels, in Manet's paintings, the painted mirror and mirrored imagery subvert pictorial conventions, engaging the viewer in an ironic encounter with aesthetic expectations. This lecture is organized in four sections. First, I examine Baudelaire's modernist tenets within the historical context of mid-19th century Paris. In the second and third sections, I examine Manet's paintings in which mirrors are either implied or represented. This is followed by a discussion of the mirror motif in Zola's novels. In the last section, I demonstrate how Zola used the mirror motif as a critical standard to champion Manet, his art, and how Manet, in turn, devised a critical pictorial response to Zola's interpretation. Section 1, Baudelairean Modernity and Historical Context. Beginning with Baudelaire's essay of the heroism of modern life, written for his 1846 Salon Review, and subsequently in his essay, The Painter of Modern Life, written in 1859 and published in 1863, Baudelaire prescribed an aesthetic of dualities and acts of self-doubling as the visceral response to the urban experience and its expression in artistic form. The later essay especially mirrored the actual events of social and physical disruptions that Manet and Zola experienced during the Second Empire's modernization of Paris. These changes began in 1852 with Baron Haussmann's comprehensive plan and continued through the turn of the century. While one cannot discount the human suffering that the Haussmannization of Paris engendered, these very ruptures and upheavals inspired Baudelaire's and then his followers' celebration of incessant change and cultural renewal. At every moment of every day, Parisians encountered visceral and oral cacophonies bursting from demolition and construction sites and from the newly laid boulevards and sidewalks. Along the same conduits, newly built building blocks generated a more ephemeral spectacle of transformations. Plate glass windows at street level reflected and refracted transient atmospheric and material conditions. Now, indoor spaces mingled with outdoor spaces and spaces in between, transforming all of Paris into a kaleidoscopic spectacle of mirrors. Thus, if modernist writers and painters subverted traditional narrative and representational devices, they did so as a response to and a means of mirroring the daily reality of transformations and fragmentation. When Baudelaire wrote of the heroism of modern life in 1846, Paris was already marked by sporadic urban renewal conditions. It was in this context that Baudelaire first defined modern beauty as possessing, in his words, something eternal and something transitory. And he extolled Paris as a site of creative and cultural renewal. As Baudelaire wrote, the artist discovers, quote, the heroism of modern life in the scenes of high life and of the thousands of uprooted lives that haunt the underworld of a great city, criminals, prostitutes. We have only to open our eyes to see and know the heroism of our day. While these uprooted lives are the heroes of Baudelaire's poetic works, in his critical writing, particularly The Painter of Modern Life, the artist becomes the hero. Here Baudelaire attributed to Constantin Guise the dual attributes of the artist as both a man of the crowd and distant from it. In the first instance, the artist is a passionate observer, in his words, for whom it becomes an immense source of enjoyment to establish his dwelling in the throng, in the ebb and flow, the bustle, the fleeting, and the infinite. The artist is an ego, a thirst for the non-ego, and reflecting it at every moment in energies more vivid than life itself, always inconstant and fleeting. Accordingly, Baudelaire redefined what he called the double composition of beauty as a constant tension between, again in his words, an eternal and invariable element and a relative circumstantial element of contemporaneity. The artist can achieve this aesthetic dualism and ultimately cultural renewal by triggering in the viewer, in his words, the shock of surprise. He does so by rendering the familiar unfamiliar and by presenting, quote, the ever new which eternally eludes but still refers to the rules and analyses of the school. But to achieve this end, the artist must first experience a process of self-doubling, which for Baudelaire characterized the artistic creative process as witnessed in his description of Constantin Guis's activities. A man of the crowd from dawn to dusk, at night the artist returns from the crowd. Alone in his studio, he reflects upon his sensory experiences and renders this their essence. In Baudelaire's words, all the materials stored higgledy-piggledy by memory are classified, ordered, harmonized, and undergo that deliberate idealization which is the product of a childlike perceptiveness that is acute and magical by its very ingeniousness. In this assessment of Guis's modernity, sketch-like techniques and ephemeral transparency convey fleeting cognitive experiences and physical engagement with the myriad Parisian populace. Similarly, in Baudelaire's earlier salon reviews, he valued fragmented painterly, or the unfinished, treatment of the canvas surface, as seen in Corot's painting, over the smooth, mirror-like, or finished surface of traditional academic painting, as seen in Gérôme's painting. This overview of Baudelaire's The Painter of Modern Life exemplifies how artistic self-doubling as an internal mirroring reflection becomes a mandate for the artist's response to modern life. In fact, in The Painter of Modern Life, Baudelaire attributed mirroring effects to the artist's creative faculties and his cognitive experience of the urban crowd. In Baudelaire's words, he, the lover of life, may also be compared to a mirror, as vast as this crowd, to a kaleidoscope endowed with consciousness, which, with every one of its movements, presents a pattern of life in all of its multiplicity. Finally, Baudelaire describes the viewer's response as a mirroring act, since she reflects upon earlier conventions now reinscribed in modern forms. In this respect, the mirror also functions as a memory device for maintaining a backward glance upon traditions and its ongoing renewal. Baudelaire's prescription for the artist and the viewer's self-doubling is consistent with modern parodic strategies as defined by literary historian Linda Hutcheon. As she demonstrates, modern parody is inherently double-coded since it inscribes both continuity with and critical distance from the old targeted text in the new text. Hutcheon further shows that, more often than not, irony is both the cause and effect of parody. Consequently, when parody produces a doubling effect between the new text and the old targeted text, this effect induces an ironic attitude or situation for the viewer-reader. It is just this irresolvable opposition between tradition and its inversion that makes irony, as critical self-reflection or mirroring, contiguous with parody. This reciprocity of technique and effect is what constitutes ironic parody, which during the 19th century became consonant with modernity. Section 2. Implied or represented mirrors in Manet's paintings. In this section, I demonstrate 3 ways in which Manet used the mirror and its reflections. First, as a corollary of the viewer's gaze, whereby vision is an optical mirror. Second, as a painted mirror that reflects both physical and social spaces. And third, as a means of critical, ironic self-reflection upon the pictorial medium. In the first case, I discuss Olympia of 1863 and Nana of 1877. In the second case, I discuss Café Concert of 1878 and a bar at the Folies Bergère of 1882. The third kind of mirroring, as critical self-reflection, is embedded in each of these 4 paintings. Although the mirror is absent in Olympia, and is non-functional in Nana. A mirroring effect is activated by the directness of the female gaze. Each figure engages the viewer in the optical mirroring of her own self-image. That is, we return the perceived image back to the figure that poses before us. By engaging the viewer with the female gaze, Manet inverted or parodied the male gaze, which traditionally beheld the passive female nude as the embodiment of ideal beauty. As is well known, Manet's painting of Olympia is a modernization of Titian's Venus of Urbino of 1538, which had become a standard for subsequent classical nudes. As seen in Titian's example, the figure's tilted head and sideways glance render the model passive in her encounter with the male viewer. When Manet turned the model's gaze directly to the viewer, he further modernized the classical nude by invoking the photographic nude, a new genre that emerged with the development of commercial photography during the early 1850s. Indeed, during the 1850s, prior to Manet's painting, photographers had already inverted the male gaze by having the model look head-on into the camera aperture. But Olympia's modernist affinity with the photographic model goes beyond her pose. Both are inscribed with a specific social identity, that of the prostitute. Because 19th century viewers regarded the photograph as a mere image of reality, the model posing for aesthetic purposes represented no one other than herself, a real woman with body hair, soiled feet, and fulsome flesh, who has just come in off the streets. This modern technological invention and the portrayal of a modern urban type are what transform Manet's interpretation of Titian's Venus into a visual parody. Manet not only removed the artifice of an idealized mythological figure to depict a recognizable prostitute, he also left intact visual references to Titian's painting. The model's gestures and pose, the cuddly dog replaced by a seductive black cat, which you can barely see on the right end of the bed, and the two-part division of the background screen. By making these transformations and keeping the original in memory, he forced the viewer to reflect backward upon the 16th century museum masterpiece and experience the transformation of the traditional ideal into the contemporary real. In his painting of Nana, Manet further endowed the model with photographic references and multiple mirrored reflections. Nana, before the mirror, also recalls studio photography, both in her pose and the presence of the mirror. As seen in this photograph, models were often posed in front of a psyche mirror, a commonplace studio prop which reflected multiple views of the figure. A more ironic photograph further signals how Manet borrowed photographic techniques to activate the viewer's gaze as a mirror reflection. Here, the photographer's presence is made real by his self-portrait, that being his self-reflection in the mirror gazing at his models. Yet his reflected presence makes his physical absence behind the camera equally real. Instead, the viewer is now situated in front of the model so that her gaze replaces the photographer's gaze through the camera apparatus. The viewer of Manet's painting also occupies the photographer's position directly in front of his model. Nana stands before the mirror, apparently applying makeup, but turns her head to pose before the implied camera. Here, the camera's mirroring is synonymous with the viewer's optical mirroring. But Nana's gaze is doubly reflected. Nana's brazen self-image is mirrored not only in the viewer's gaze, but also in her top-hatted client's gaze. In each case are his admiring gaze, reproduces Nana's self-image as it reflects back to her, creating a narcissistic circuit of self-absorption and self-satisfaction. It is for this reason that Manet rendered the actual mirror useless. Instead of reflecting Nana's image, the oval surface reflects the painterly medium through which the artist has made Nana visually real. The mirror thus becomes an ironic device to reflect upon the production and reception of the painted image. Is the mirror a mirrored reflection, like a photograph, or a creative representation of the real? It is precisely this question that Manet addresses in his mirrored reflections of urban social spaces. In the cafe concert, Manet creates a pictorial space that induces experiential associations with the modern condition. In doing so, he uses the mirror to parody pictorial perspective. To begin with, our initial encounter with the painting is an ironic one. At first glance, the singer on the stage appears to be situated in the receding space of the concert hall. However, upon closer viewing, we realize that the image of the singer is a mirror reflection. This reflected image is partially defined by the mirror's gilt frame, while the staged performance takes place in front of the foreground figures. Thus, where we expect to see into pictorial depth beyond the painted surface, as in Jean Barrot's La Patisserie Cloak of 1889, Manet's mirror prohibits our entry into the pictorial space. This negation is reinforced by the mirror's painted surface. Broadly laid brushstrokes render the mirror as flat as the gray wall beside it. Even more so than Nana's mirror, the cafe concert mirror is a critical reflection upon the painter's materials with which experiences of modernity are made real. Accordingly, Manet parodies perspective by using the mirror to place the viewer within rather outside the picture space. If the singer's performance takes place in front of the foreground figures, then the viewer of Manet's painting is situated between those figures and the stage. By placing the viewer in the middle of the picture space, Manet compels the viewer to reflect upon the transient, visceral conditions of modernity. At once fleeting and fragmented, spaces of modernity defy expectations with ironic and shocking effects. Ironic encounters are also triggered by the way Manet uses the mirror as a reflection upon modern social conditions. For one thing, while the cafe concert was a modern site where upper and lower classes mingled, Manet has ruptured this alliance by inserting a still life between the foreground figures who gaze in opposite directions. This rupture signifies the woman on the left as a lorette, a prostitute who ranks above the streetwalker, and the top-hatted man as her current potential lover. Given the man's attire, he represents the upper bourgeoisie or lower-level aristocracy. Manet intensified the social chasm between the lorette and her lover by aligning the lorette with the other working women on the left side of the composition. In the cafe concert, Manet has depicted three urban types of the working woman, the prostitute, the waitress, and the singer. Aligned from bottom to top, the head of each woman leads the viewer's eyes along an arrow-shaped path and into the supposed pictorial space. However, although their bodies connect in this formal arrangement, their gazes and gestures are disconnected. Here, too, Manet has registered a social scale among the working class women. The lorette remains at the lowest rung, while the waitress can aspire to the middle class, and the singer can gain social privilege among the upper classes. Thus, the cafe concert mirrors the social order of modern Paris, at once unified and divided. In a bar at the Folies Bergère, Manet extended the mirror as a parodic device and as a means for invoking ironic social reflection. Here, however, the mirror almost covers the entire picture surface, as indicated by the gilt frame in the lower portion of the canvas. This mirroring suggests that Manet intended the painting to be a celebration of Baudelairean modernity. Even more than in the cafe concert, in a bar at the Folies Bergère, Manet's parodic formal devices conform to Baudelaire's celebration of modernism's multifariousness, that being a state of incessant paradox, surprise, and change. As in Olympia, Manet's ironic behavior can first be identified in the way he parodies the rules of the school, that is, museum masterpieces and academic techniques. In a bar at the Folies Bergère, the painted mirror provokes contrastive associations with the whole tradition of mirrored feminine beauty and with the smooth academic finish in which this cultural ideal was portrayed. These include mythological types, such as Titian's Venus with a Mirror of 1555 and Ingres' portrait of Countess de Haussonville of 1845. Manet subverts these conventions by rupturing expectations for a mimetic representation of mirrored reflections. For one thing, unlike the contiguity between the figure and her reflection in the traditional compositions, in Manet's painting, the barmaid's reflection is too far removed from her centered frontal pose. That this disjunction was intentionally ironic is confirmed by Manet's study for a bar at the Folies Bergère. In this rendering, the barmaid's reflection is directly aligned with her actual figure. In the final painting, the sketch-like painterly brushwork also subverts our expectations for the smooth, mirrored surfaces in academic painting. As in the cafe concert, in a bar at the Folies Bergère, Manet depicts modernity by way of the fragment form. First, we encounter fragments of colors and pigments that do not physically cohere. Likewise, the mirror image is itself a fragment of an overall ambience and fragments the objects and figures reflected therein. The disconnected gazes between the barmaid and her customer, who is reflected in the mirror, add a psychological fragmentation of the whole. And by the way, in the sketch, the man and the woman do exchange gazes. At the same time, these painterly and figurative fragments do cohere as the mirror image of the contradictory, ironic condition apropos modern life and the corollary experience of endless transformations. As an actual place of popular entertainment and social class mingling, the bar at the Folies Bergère Theater signified a microcosm of the urban whole. Yet in the painting of this Parisian site, as in the cafe concert, Manet inserted social rupture within the disparate crowd. The barmaid signifies this rupture. Given her status as a working class woman, she is denied the pleasures that surround her. An isolated, static figure, the barmaid stands in contrast to the dynamic spectacle of revelers, shimmering lightworks, and lively paint marks. Her psychological isolation is compounded by her physical position. For in fact, the mirrored spectacle is only a reflection of the action that unfolds before her. Just where the viewer stands in relation to that mirrored space will be considered in the next section. Section 3, mirrors inferred or represented in Zola's novels. Given the centrality of the mirror in a bar at the Folies Bergère, I now want to demonstrate the parodic devices and ironic effects that the painting shares with the naturalist novel. The sustained doubleness that ironic parody engenders through the playing with multiple conventions is what initially connects Manet's painting with Zola's naturalist novels. For the writer, as for the painter, the mirror is central to achieving these effects. It is important to note, however, that the visual comparisons I consider are grounded in 3 Baudelairean themes of modernity. 1, creative and experiential acts of self-doubling. 2, the familiar or conventional made unfamiliar. And 3, the portrayal of heroes of high life and low life in modern Paris. In particular, I will discuss the mirror as a visual form and formal structure in 2 Zola novels, L'Assommoir of 1877 and Nana of 1880. Like Manet, Zola uses actual mirrors as commonplace interior furnishings and as vehicles for multiple reflections within interior spaces. More important for this study, however, Zola uses the mirror indirectly as an ordering device with which to contrast reciprocal yet opposing events within the narrative structure. Given this latter practice, I use a structural analysis to compare how the writer and painter use formal patterns and technical means to enforce a mirroring dialogue between the reader-viewer and the text or work of art. That is, each medium invites the viewer's anticipation of a conventional series of events, such as illusionism in painting or idealist plot development in the novel. And then this same medium denies these same expectations. In this section, I review how the mirror motif embedded in the novel's text functions as a parodic device for critical self-reflection. Literary historian David Bagley provides a model for the structural analysis of ironic parody within the naturalist novel. As he observes, it is precisely the heroic character types and idealized plot development of earlier 19th century romantic novels that are targeted for ironic inversions in the naturalist novel. In the earlier narratives, conflicts are resolved in fortuitous outcomes for the characters and their personal development. However, in the naturalistic novel, an ironic narrative sets up contrast between a character's hopes, ideals, aspirations, and ensuing plight. While the reader's expectations for edifying character and plot development are met at the novel's inception, its banal ending subverts those expectations by denying resolution or redemptive closure. In the naturalist novel, heroes are replaced by anti-heroes, and edifying evolution is replaced by degeneration. This degenerative course of event is what Bagley calls the entropic meta-theme of the naturalist novel. As suggested by the root word entropy, meaning decay, the entropic meta-theme narrates the moral and social decay brought on by modernization. The narrative structure of entropy thus deploys the banal ending as a parodic strategy of inversion and subversion. It is in the narrative space between the novel's inception, where the reader's expectations are met, and the ensuing events, where the expectations are denied, that the reader is caught in a textual snare. L'Assommoir provides an example of the entropic meta-theme and the snare it engenders. At the beginning of the novel, the main character, Gervaise, rises above her rural origins and achieves bourgeois prosperity as a laundress proprietor in Paris. But her success is short-lived. Midway through the novel, the author incisively details the anti-heroine's slow degeneration. Consumed by material indulgence and poverty, Gervais dies from alcoholism and starvation at the end of the novel. Bagley's structural analysis of the entropic meta-theme in L'Assommoir further demonstrates how the mirror motif is embedded in Zola's novels. In this diagram, Bagley charts the events of Gervais' rise and decline on either side of the triangle. Here, the narrative is structured by mirroring reciprocity, since each chapter that records these events is paired symmetrically with its opposite. Similar to the narrative novel's subversive narrative structure, Manet produces an ironic situation by way of an ironic version of pictorial structural form. Here, as in the novel's textual snare, the reader is engaged in a visual snare. By presenting a painting of a mirrored reflection, Manet initiates and then disrupts a conventional way of entering the picture. For one thing, pictorial depth is contravened by the painted surface. Likewise, the male figure's presence and absence is central to the viewer's ironic aesthetic experience. Although we see the man's frontal view reflected in the right side of the mirror, the direction of his gaze and the absent view of his back in front of the bar deny our conventional expectations for entering an illusionary space. That is, we would expect a mediating figure or object to direct the viewer into the picture space, as seen in Barreau's Au Café. Here, the figures form a narrative grouping extending into our space, and the empty chair invites our participation in the action. Furthermore, the mirror is simply illusionary, functioning to extend the interior space within the pictorial space. In the absence of a mediating figure or object in Manet's bar, we are placed directly in the middle of the spectacle, facing the barmaid and the inescapable reflexivity and materiality of the mirror. The novel Nana provides another example of the textual mirroring that Zola embeds in his text. The novel also provides historical links with his earlier novel L'Assommoir and with Manet's painting of Nana. In L'Assommoir, Nana appears at the end of the novel as Gervais' daughter from L'Assommoir, who grows up from a playful infant to become a seductive young woman. Blonde and buxom at the age of 15, she procures a rich 55-year-old bourgeois lover, whom she quickly abandons to pursue the life of an upscale prostitute. This is at the end of L'Assommoir. In the novel Nana, we are introduced to Nana when she is 18, and there's debates on how old she really is. She might be as young as 16. In the first chapter, Nana takes Paris by storm as a thinly veiled blonde Venus, the title of an operetta performed at the fictional Théâtre des Variétés. Nana's career as a courtesan is also the story of how she destroys every man who pursues her. Count Moffat is the most injured. He loses his fortune to Nana's voracious appetite for material riches, commits adultery, and is humiliated by Nana's betrayals in extending her affections to other men. The entropic meta-theme also prevails over this narrative. Nana's rise to stardom on the stage is short-lived, replaced by her achieving entry into the aristocracy. However, Nana's insatiable appetite for expensive finery and food not only ruins men's fortunes, but leads to her own ruin. In the last chapter, Nana leaves Paris to foreign exotic parts, having become bored with her abundance of riches. When she returns months later, she gets smallpox and dies a horrible, disfiguring death. As in L'Assommoir, the entropic meta-theme in Nana is structured by mirrored textual symmetries. As Pierre Petit has shown, The mirroring occurs at the level of localization. That is, the sites where the action takes place. Petit divides the 14 chapters into 3 locations, as illustrated in the diagram. The chapters labeled A take place au spectacle. Chapters labeled B take place chez Nana. And chapters labeled C take place chez Moffat. In the first 5 chapters, the scenes alternate between B and C, Nana's and Moffat's residences, and are framed by A, the Théâtre des Variétés. These scenes form the pattern A, B, C, B, A. The next 3 chapters at the novel's center take place elsewhere. Chapter 6 takes place in Nana's country villa, where she gains entry into an aristocratic social life. The next 2 chapters, 7 and 8, return to Paris. These 2 chapters form a textual snare and are pivotal to Nana's degeneration. Immersed in a frenzy of extravagance, Nana traverses the city to various locations, trying to satisfy her insatiable carnal desires. In each of these centrally located chapters, which Petit marks as locations of instability, Nana herself embodies the spectacle. Symmetry returns to the last 6 chapters, again forming the patterns A, B, C, B, A. Except for chapter 11, another outdoor scene at the racetracks, the same alternating sequence of locations between Nana's residence B and Moffat's residence C is framed by A, the world of the spectacle. Chapter 11 takes place at the Théâtre des Variétés, and chapter 14 at the Grand Hotel. In this last scene, the spectacle resumes with Nana's death. She dies surrounded by women spectators in her hotel room, while male spectators wait for her demise in the hotel lobby. This structural patterning of mirroring locations on either side of the locus of instability also introduces another mirroring experience for the reader midway through the novel. Just as the viewer is located at the center of the spectacle in Manet's bar, so the reader is located at the center of Nana's performative spectacle. The mise-en-abîme is another mirroring device that Zola uses in Nana. According to Lucien Dallenbach, the mise-en-abîme is a means by which the work turns back on itself, appears to be a kind of reflection, or in other words, it is the mirror in the text. In the case of Nana, the mirror in the text appears as a story within a story, which occurs in chapter 7, strategically placed at the exact center of the novel. Nana and Moffat are in her dressing room, and Nana is gazing at her naked self in the full-length mirror, having, quote, grown absorbed by her ecstatic self-contemplation. Moffat, however, is troubled by the story just published in a journal titled The Golden Fly, which he reads to Nana. The story describes, in Zola's words, the life of a harlot descended from generations of drunkards, who now, with her rottenness that is allowed to ferment among the populace, is carried upward and rots the aristocracy, and corrupts and disorganizes all of Paris. The story, of course, mirrors Nana's history and Moffat's corruption. Realizing this, Moffat at first is repulsed. He then gazes at Nana's reflection in the mirror and becomes seduced once again by, quote, her satin skin and her supple contours of her shape, unquote. If this textual scene reminds you of Manet's Nana, it is not by accident. For one thing, Manet's 1877 painting was named after the young woman Nana, who became the prostitute at the end of L'Assommoir, which was published in the same year Manet's painting of Nana. For another, Zola used the painting to create the stage-like setting and the character's position in Nana's dressing room in the novel. As in the painting, the novel reader is caught in the narcissistic circuit of Nana's gaze, which is returned to her by Moffat's gaze. This creative exchange between painter and writer is not only an important historical event, but it also invites an investigation of their critical exchanges. While Zola championed Manet in his critical reviews of the artist's works, he did so in the name of naturalism, and the mimetic reflections naturalism promoted. Manet, in turn, responded with pictorial retorts to the limitations that naturalism imposed. It is this critical exchange and the mirror's pivotal place therein that I will treat in the remainder of this paper. Section 4, the mirror as a critical device. When Zola began writing about Manet in 1866, he invoked the mirror motif as a critical tool for promoting Manet and his work as a modern way of seeing. Zola regarded Manet as a mirroring agent and his art as a mirror reflection of both his subjects' physical appearance and their social existence. In doing so, Zola the critic transposed his literary theory onto the artist and his works. This transposition can be traced from the two critical reviews of Manet's art that Zola wrote in 1866 and 1867. For in fact, it was during these years that Zola also formulated his theoretical tenets of the naturalist novel. Zola first published these tenets in the 1868 preface to the second edition of Thérèse Raquin, originally published in 1867. Here he explained what he called his analytical method as a defense against accusations of immorality in his novel. In this defense, Zola argued that he used the analytical method inspired by scientific curiosity as a means to, quote, simply be an analyst who may have become engrossed in human corruption, but who has done so as a surgeon might in an operating theater. For Zola, the naturalist writer depicts these objective observations with, in Zola's words, a clear and natural language. As such, naturalist language functions as a mirror reflection of reality. In this respect, Zola's 1868 description of his literary method echoes the analytic method he ascribed to Manet 2 years earlier. At that time, in his 1866 Salon Review, Zola praised Manet's talent for, in Zola's words, its simplicity and accuracy, that is to say, the exact observation of objects. This earlier assessment of Manet suggests that Zola's naturalist theories were not only shaped by science, but the pictorial arts as well. In fact, in his 1868 preface, Zola compares his process of translating human nature to the painter's process of mirroring physical nature. As Zola wrote, "While I was busy writing Thérèse Raquin, I forgot the world and devoted myself to copying life exactly and meticulously, giving myself up entirely to precise analysis of the human being. The human side of the models ceased to exist, just as it ceases to exist for the eye of the artist, who has a naked woman sprawled in front of him, but who is solely concerned with getting onto his canvas a true representation of her shape and coloration." Zola elaborated on Manet's direct observation and simple translation of nature in his longer 1867 Salon Review, where he called Manet an analytic painter. As such, Manet is just like the modern scientist who has, in Zola's words, returned to a precise observation of facts. The artist, he writes, is, quote, an interpreter of that which is, and his works consist of a precise description made in a human and original language. For Zola, the individual artist's originality or uniqueness is only important for the way his vision is affected by his so-called temperament. That is, the faculty that heightens one aspect of nature over another. As Zola elsewhere explained, a work of art is a corner of nature seen through a temperament. When Zola applied this axiom to Manet, he further aligned the artist with his own analytical method and the new art it engendered. For Zola, it is Manet's temperament that renders natural light with heightened brightness, which in turn enhances his formal simplicity. Zola thus surmised, "If I were asked what new language Edouard Manet spoke, I would reply, he speaks a language of simplicity and exactitude. The new note that his temperament contributes is one of bright tones, filling the canvas with light. The translation that he gives us is a precise and simplified one, achieving its effect through large units and broad masses." Zola here posited the painter's language as analogous with the naturalist writer's language. Both mediums function as an objective mirror of nature. Zola's description of Olympia, written for his 1867 Manet Review, demonstrates how he applied his art criticism and naturalist theory to a specific painting. In the first case, Zola explains how the formal elements signify the artist's direct observation and nature seen through a temperament. Viewing Olympia directly, Zola describes how, using his words, "At the first glance, you distinguish only the tones played off against each other, a large, pale spot on the dark background. Similarly," Zola observes, "when you look closely, all you see are patches of color." And he says, "Details have disappeared and everything is simplified." However, Zola recommends that the viewer must, again in his words, step back a bit in order to reconstruct reality. Then he discovers a curious thing happens. Each object falls into its proper plane. Olympia's head projects from the background in astonishing relief. The bouquet becomes marvelously fresh and brilliant. Zola attributes this transformation of paint into reality to what he described as the artist's accurate eye and direct hand. The painter worked as nature works, in simple masses and large areas of light, and his work has a somewhat rude and austere appearance of nature itself. Zola then explains how the artist's direct translation of physical nature extends to the artist's translation of human nature. In order to extol Manet's painting as an accurate representation of social realities, Zola identified Olympia as, quote, "a girl of our time, whom we have met on the streets." As if observing a specimen of the urban environment for his own novel, Zola further explained, "She is a girl of 16, doubtless some model whom Edouard Manet has quietly copied just as she was. When other artists correct nature by painting Venus, they lie. Manet asked himself, why not tell the truth? As usual, the public took good care not to understand what the painter wanted. There are even people who have looked for a philosophical meaning in the painting." This last statement deserves our attention since it denies meaningful content in Manet's painting, a denial repeated by Zola's later claim that Manet, quote, "never wanted to put ideas into his paintings." Both statements reveal Zola's attempt to enlist Manet into the ranks of naturalism. However, in doing so, he rid the painter of any extra pictorial or ironic intentions, as well as rid his paintings of the parodic play with pictorial conventions. Manet, an avid reader of Zola and personal friend to the writer, would have likely read Zola's 1868 preface to Thérèse Raquin. This being the case, what would Manet have thought about Zola's subjugation of painting to writing and his refusal of meaningful content in his art? To answer this question, we cannot rely on textual evidence, since Manet wrote little about his art. Instead, we can demonstrate that Manet painted Zola's portrait in 1868 as a retort to the critics' misinterpretation of the painter's artistic method and pictorial intentions. Manet's portrait of Zola also reveals how the artist, in turn, appropriated the writer and his writings to his own artistic agenda. As Robert Lethbridge and others have argued, Zola is awkwardly misplaced among objects and images that are alien to him. Instead of placing Zola amidst his own writings and literary activities, which is suggested in Nadar's photograph of the author, Zola holds an open book, Charles Blanc's popular Histoire des Peintures de tous les écoles of 1849 to 69, which Manet would have owned and relied on for its illustrations. The Japanese screen behind the sitter on the left and the Japanese print in the upper right refer to Manet's engagement with Japanese art. The print is mounted with a reproduction of Velázquez, The Drinkers, from the 17th century, marking Manet's admiration of Spanish art, and an engraving of Manet's Olympia, which he himself made. Ironically, this Olympia turns her gaze toward Zola in appreciation of his admiration for the painting as he wrote about it in his 1867 review of Manet's work. Directly below Olympia is a blue pamphlet inscribed with Manet's name on its cover. This pamphlet marks another tribute to Manet. It is a reprint of Zola's 1867 review of Manet's work, which was then published on the occasion of the artist's one-man exhibition that took place in May of 1867. Here, however, Manet reversed the writer's appropriation of his painting by appropriating Zola's writing. Manet replaced the pamphlet's printed title with his personal signature used to sign the painting. Although Zola is oblivious to all the visual references to Manet's artistic sources, we are not. For one thing, we see and recognize the pictorial cues from which Zola looks away. For another, compositional delineations compel the viewer to focus on pictorial images and the artist's inscription. Manet directs our gaze in a diagonal direction, first to scan the illustrated pages of the open book, then to follow the book's binding to Zola's thumb and fingers, which in turn directs our attention to the artist's signature. Similarly, Manet uses the L-shaped contours of Zola's arm and torso to repeat the outline of the frame that holds his print collection. In doing so, Manet references the pictorial methods that underlie his art. Now the viewer's gaze mirrors the artist's self-reflection on his medium and the conventions specific to pictorial representation. In short, we can agree with Lethbridge, who asserts that the portrait's internal pictorial references reassert Manet's creative context with tradition and Zola, which Zola had missed. Notwithstanding Manet's reassertion of his painting's autonomy and its tradition, Zola responded to the portrait in a literary way. Indeed, he used his 1868 Salon Review to reassert Manet's position as an analytical observer in the service of his naturalist theories. Here, Zola echoed his 1868 preface to Therese Rickhan, where he compared the writer's process to the painter's process, wherein each forgets his subject's physical presence during sessions of intense observation. Thus, in describing Manet's performance while painting his portrait, Zola recalls, "Manet had forgotten me. He didn't know I was there. He was copying me as he would have copied any human animal, with an intention and artistic awareness, the like of which I have never seen. Like the disengaged writer who only records what he observes, so Manet painted both the surrounding still lifes and the living model with equal intensity and color harmony. Zola thus concludes, Manet is before all a naturalist. His eye sees and renders objects with an elegant simplicity, unquote. In the following years, Zola further developed the naturalist novel and continued to champion Manet's achievements along similar lines of his own literary theory. Zola variously called Manet a modern artist, a realist, a positivist in 1875, a naturalist, an analyst in 1876, and one of the tireless workers of naturalism in 1880. With all these labels, Zola matched Manet's art and method with the later positivist tenets Zola presented in the essay, The Experimental Novel, which is Zola's treatise on his scientific methods and was published in 1880. Here, Zola explained his determinist techniques of studying humans through their relationship with the social environment. Like the scientist, the writer is free of personal feelings and moralizing and controls, quote, a priori ideas by observation and experiment, unquote. While Zola aligned his experimental method with the scientist, he also aligned the artist with the experimental novelist. As he put it, the artist has the same starting points as a scientist. He stands before nature, has an a priori idea, and works in line with that idea. Yet Zola cautioned the artist only diverges from the scientist if he carries his idea out to the end without verifying its exactness to observation and experiment. In conclusion, I want to return to A Bar at the Folie Bergère to argue that this painting also represents Manet's retort against Zola's latest appropriations of his art. Manet began the painting in 1881, just 1 year after Zola had called the painter one of the tireless workers of naturalism and had just published the experimental novel. Manet's retort is not just against the assimilation of the visual by the textual, but also against the takeover of modernity by science. With A Bar at the Folie Bergère, Manet reclaimed his Baudelairean modernity and at the same time disassociated himself from Zola's determinist positivism. As we have seen, because Manet's painting shares mirroring techniques and urban themes with the naturalist novel, associations with entropic meta-themes are inevitably encoded in the network of visual forms, whether figurative or abstract. For example, for the 19th century viewer, the barmaid might foretell the working class woman's inevitable fall into prostitution. Likewise, the dematerial ambience of the cafe concert scene might evoke an atmosphere of incessant decay. Conversely, as I have argued, these surroundings evoke the incessant flux and contradictions that Baudelairean modernity extolled. In short, I think Manet shared Baudelaire's affirmation of such modern phenomena as a source of cultural renewal. Manet thus used the mirror to demonstrate that his art was not just a static record of modern life, but rather a dynamic translation of the lived experience. As earlier discussed, it was this cognitive experience that Baudelaire attributed to the painter of modern life, comparing that artist to, quote, a mirror as vast as the crowd, to a kaleidoscope endowed with consciousness, which with every one of its movements presents life in all of its multiplicity. Given his Baudelairean allegiance, Manet's choice of the the Folies Bergère as a site of modernity can be explained by the spectacle of mirrors actually encountered in the building's interiors. Both the semicircular theater and the adjoining rectangular hall or winter garden were lined with mirrors, as seen, or you're trying to see in this photographs, where the camera flash reflects off the walls of the theater and winter garden. So the theater is in the photographs above, and the winter garden is below. Graphic illustrations of the Folies Bergère also suggest the ways in which Manet combined the two spaces of winter garden and the auditorium into a single space in order to portray the experiential, cognitive effects of modernity. First, these documents record the presence of several bars located at both ends and perhaps at the center of the semicircular balcony of the theater, and along one side of the ground story of the winter garden. Second, a more realistic rendering of the bar at the Folies Bergère by Jean-Louis Foran illustrates the actual curvature of a mirrored bar at one end of the theater balcony. As this diagram shows, the mirror's curvature explains why Manet rendered the barmaid's and her client's reflection off-center. The second diagram indicates the location of the composite parts of the painting. The mirror's concavity also explains why the countertop of the bar on the left is reflected in the mirror but is not shown in the foreground. We can also see that the viewer's position is identical with that of the client, and I will return to this slide in a moment. Finally, and of particular importance, a poster depicts how the staircase arcade bridged the theater and winter garden, and that the two spaces actually opened up onto each other. This image on the right suggests that the figures in Manet's mirrored balcony scene are both viewing the stage and mingling in the two-story rectangular winter garden. That adjoining space is further suggested by Manet's rendering of perspectival depth, here marked by the receding orthogonal lines behind the barmaid. Yet the cropped legs of the trapeze artist in the upper left corner indicate that we are standing within a theater where the trapeze act was performed. Given these simultaneous views, we can assume that the artist distorted reality and mastered his techniques in representing the real spectacle of the Folies Bergère as an unending hall of mirrors, mirroring, in effect, the kaleidoscopic experience of modern Paris. As a result, the viewer inhabits the unstable space that Nana occupies at the center of the novel, immersed in the multitude of the crowd and its infinite transience. If we accept that Manet's bar at the Folies Bergère is not one bar, but a composite of all the bars enclosed within its walls, then we will also agree that his portrayal is a product of the lived experience transformed by his imagination rather than the translation of nature by his temperament. Like the concave mirror, Manet's act of mirroring converges everything into a composite image. As such, another Baudelairean narrative unfolds, one that follows the creative process prescribed in the painter of modern life. As quoted earlier, Baudelaire described the modern artist as a man of the crowd from dawn to dusk, who at night retreats from the crowd. Alone in his studio, the artist reflects upon his sensory experiences, and then, quoting Baudelaire, all the materials undergo that deliberate idealization, which is accurate and magical by its very ingeniousness. Manet followed both the process and means of Baudelaire's prescription for the creative translation of nature. As the ink drawing of the Folies Bergère shows, Manet rendered his first impressions on the spot. Away from the crowds in his studio, He retrieved the essence of the cafe concert and represented its scintillating ambience in the fragmented but unified surface of the canvas. If his viewers recognized a Barthes of Folies Bergère as a dynamic synthesis of low art and high art, of real and remembered space, of sketch-like brushwork and visual spectacle, would they not have viewed Manet's painting with, in Baudelaire's words, the shock of surprise? If so, Manet would have effected an ironic aesthetic response that Baudelaire celebrated as the ultimate purpose of artistic creation. To summarize, Manet responded to Zola's naturalist appropriation of his art by demonstrating how the painted mirror, the painted canvas, sustains the transitoriness of modernity and its ironic effects. In doing so, he created an experiential immediacy that the novel could not have achieved. Although in Zola's novels, character and plot developments are structured by mirrored symmetries, these developments depend on sequential events that unfold in real time for the reader and abstract time within the novel's structure. Ironically, the mise-en-abîme in Nana comes closest to a point where visual and textual mirrorings converge. That is, the story within the story, illustrated by Moffat reading The Golden Fly to Nana, is also reflected in the mirror reflection of Nana's gaze in Moffat's gaze. To be sure, Zola adapted this scene from Manet's painting, Nana. Manet, however, ironized this mimetic interpretation of his paintings. Always reflecting on his medium, in the Barthes of Folies Bergère, Manet used the mirror to subvert mimetic reflections and to present instead a painting within a painting which is about a painting, which is about a painting. Here, finally, the viewer is caught in a visual snare that defies narrative appropriation and prolongs ironic contemplation. Thank you.